So this morning's speaker has a long and varied biography. I don't want to take up too much time reading it because I know you want to hear from Joe, but I will give you some of the highlights. So Joe Chuman is a dear friend and colleague. We worked together at the New York Society for Ethical Culture, starting there in 2008. He is not only a clergy leader, but an activist, educator, and writer who's been with the New York Society, as I said, from 2008. He retired 2 years ago from serving as the leader of the Bergen County Society, where he was there for 46 years. Is that possible? Joe has 2 master's degrees and a doctorate in the philosophy of religion from Columbia University. He's taught courses in human rights all over the place, at Columbia and at Hunter, and he also taught human rights at the United Nations University for Peace in San Jose, Costa Rica. He's written scores of articles for newspapers, journals, and opinions. I follow him on Substack, so I hope that you will follow him there as well. He's an activist who's worked in the fields of human rights, civil liberties, human relations, and much more. He's also the founder of the Northern New Jersey Sanctuary Coalition, a nonprofit organization that provides a comprehensive range of humanitarian services, including housing for asylum seekers. And I know, Joe, that you housed a family from Syria, so you certainly walk the talk, and now we will hear you talk.
Well, thank you so very much. I'm happy to be here. It's been, I think, 15 years since I've addressed the Brooklyn Society. Last time it was in your magisterial meeting house on Prospect Park West, and I should say this place is not quite as ornate, but in some ways it's more functional. I could never get used to speaking around the corner of that L-shaped room that didn't seem well equipped, right, as an auditorium. So in some ways, this transitional housing is not as grand, but in some ways more functional.
Joe, I'm sorry to interrupt you. Could we please move the mic a little closer to you? We're having a hard time hearing.
I always have trouble with microphones. Yeah, reminds me when Lincoln gave the Gettysburg Address, he addressed 15,000 people. That's the benefit of a mic. But here we are, you know, in the 21st century. Yeah, I just have to say one thing about going. I'm dressed this way, not because I usually dress this way for platforms, but or at all, I should say. But I have a memorial to officiate at the New York Society at 2 o'clock. So I'm going to have to scoot out. I don't mean to be impolite, but I'm going to have to leave it around 12:30 to make sure I can park and get there in time and, you know, relate to the bereaved and so on, which is, I think, an important purpose. Anyway, I'm happy that, let me just say, I'm happy to see Liesl Burns, my colleague of many years, whom I haven't seen for many years. And quite a nice surprise to see you, Liesl. And of course, it's good to be with my dear friend Anne and colleague. Anne invited me. Tomorrow's Martin Luther King Day, of course, and she said the Society wanted to have a program in commemoration or related to Martin Luther King and his work, and I said I'd be happy to do that. So, as noted, the title of my address is The Radical Martin Luther King We Do Not Know. In his acceptance speech of December 10th, 2009, upon receiving the Nobel Peace Prize, President Barack Obama said the following, quote, "We must begin by acknowledging the hard truth. We will not eradicate violent conflict in our lifetimes. There will be times when nations acting individually or in concert will find the use of force not only necessary, but morally justified. I make this statement mindful of what Martin Luther King Jr. said in this same ceremony years ago," and he quotes, "Violence never brings permanent peace. It solves no social problem. It merely creates new and more complicated ones," end quote. As someone who stands here, Obama said, as someone who stands here as a direct consequence of Dr. King's life work, I am living testimony to the moral force of nonviolence. I know there's nothing weak, nothing passive, nothing naive in the creed and lives of Gandhi and King. But, Obama goes on to say, as a head of state sworn to protect and defend my nation, I cannot be guided by their examples alone. I face the world as it is and cannot stand idle in the face of threats to the American people. For make no mistake, evil does exist in the world. A nonviolent movement could not have halted Hitler's armies. Negotiations cannot convince al-Qaeda's leaders to lay down their arms. To say that force may sometimes be necessary is not a call to cynicism. It is a recognition of history, the imperfections of man, and the limits of reason, end quote. Now, in my view, this invocation of force may seem like an odd acknowledgement to make when receiving the world's foremost prize dedicated to the opposition of war. I suspect his European hosts were squirming in their seats as he said that, you know. But Obama, I believe, was revealing himself above all to be a pragmatist and not an idealist. And for those keen to the history of ideas, he was a disciple of the Christian realist and author of Cold War containment policy, the Protestant theologian Reinhold Niebuhr, who argued for the judicious use of force to contain Soviet expansionism. As Soviet communism was to Niebuhr, so global terrorism was to Obama. But in giving homage to Martin Luther King and contrasting himself to King, Obama also implied an interesting and important dynamic in the history and function of religion. In the history of religion, a difference is usually drawn between, quote, the priestly tradition on the one hand and the prophetic tradition on the other. The priestly tradition is that which we ascribe to the institutions of religion, which can be passed down, the churches and churchmen, the teachings, the myths, the holy figures, the doctrines, dogmas, liturgies, and practices of religion. These comprise the major part of religion. By contrast, there is the, quote, prophetic tradition. And although a minor voice in the religions, in my view, it is where religion is at its best and does its most important work. The prophetic tradition is, of course, vested in the figure of the prophet. Who is the prophet, we may ask? The prophet is the man or woman who stands outside the precincts of established authority and critiques the abuses and corruption of that authority by the light of loftier moral ideals and truths of the tradition. The prophet has no military nor economic power, only the power of ethical ideals and ethical witness by which he calls those in authority to a higher standard of conduct. Because the prophet stands outside the precincts of power, as Obama implies, he has greater freedom to express his ideals and act on them than one who is constrained by the competing demands that come from holding political or public office. Most would agree that Martin Luther King and Mohandas Gandhi were the most illustrious, venerable, and courageous examples of the prophetic religious tradition in the 20th century. It was again because they stood outside the arenas of official authority and government, and they could powerfully influence the corruption of government and the established order from the outside. Am I making my point clear about the, okay, good. So by contrast, we might conclude that had Martin Luther King held political office, had he been a government functionary, we might not have had a civil rights movement, or at least a diminished one, without his exemplary and commanding leadership. To be part of the system is to be very much constrained by different constituencies and interests pulling from many directions. I think that was implicitly Obama's point when he received the Nobel Prize. Even the purest and most powerful idealist will find his or her ideals very quickly sullied once he or she holds political office. But the outsider, by contrast, though devoid of the power attached to the arms of state, is able to speak freely and leverage the authority and influence that comes from morality and appeals to righteousness and conscience. All this is an introduction to an exploration of the worldview and political commitments of Martin Luther King. It is my contention that there was a deeper dimension to King that animated his courageous struggle against racism that gets very little exposure, but which he held with the deepest conviction and defended in uncompromising terms. Martin Luther King was a national icon, and one of the few Americans, of course, honored with a national holiday, which, as one of the greatest figures in our history, he assuredly deserved. But this fame, I contend, comes with a price. As Anne noted, to be transformed into an icon, and icon is the Greek word for image. To be transformed into an icon is like being transformed into a marble statue. to be shorn of all imperfections and disquieting details. And so this has been in great measure the fate of Martin Luther King. To be fated with a national holiday means that one needs to be the object of a national consensus that is accepted by everyone or nearly everyone. To be so transformed as to have one's persona and one's achievements, as well as the ideas that one stood for, translated into the lowest and least offensive common denominator. And so at official commemorations, King, and I've been to many of them, King invoking his March on Washington speech, or at least the last refrains of it, is most often portrayed as, quote, a dreamer, okay, which is only a stone's throw away from being dreamy or otherwise otherworldly, and thereby rendered perhaps a bit harmless, okay. This spirit was articulated, in fact, by Ronald Reagan, whom we might forget signed the legislation officially making Martin Luther King's birthday a national holiday. This is what Reagan said and what King meant to him. Quote, "Traces of bigotry still mar America. So each year on Martin Luther King Day, let us not only recall Dr. King, but rededicate ourselves to the commandments he believed in and sought to live every day. Thou shalt love thy God with all thy heart and and thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself," end quote. Well, it's very nice. With the stroke of a pen, King got a send-off to the next world very early. If this is all that King meant, I think he's reduced to a harmless cliche. Okay. Moreover, King is often put forward as a promoter of racial harmony. In the long range, that is certainly true. His ultimate vision was that of what he called the beloved community, okay, an integrated community of blacks and whites living together in equality with cooperation and mutual respect. That religious vision was given a more secular treatment in his famous I Have a Dream speech in Washington in August 1963. But what is almost always absent in official portrayals of Martin Luther King is the underlying political values, analysis, and commitments that fueled his ultimate vision of a redeemed American society. It is my contention that Martin Luther King was far more radical in his political beliefs than he is officially portrayed. And it's my goal this morning to shed some light on the radical dimension of his thought in an effort to bring greater justice to what he believed in and greater honesty to a portrayal of who he was. But my interests are not merely biographical or historical. One of the most distressing realities of our society at this time is that we can ask, where are the moral voices? Where is the moral leadership which holds out a redemptive, inspiring vision of American society? We're just torn apart. Where are the ethical giants who can evoke from us the better angels of our nature and inspire us to more lasting things? There seem to be none. Not in religion, certainly not in politics, nor seemingly anywhere in public life. Maybe Americans have become too tribalized, and indeed we have become viciously tribalized. Moreover, whatever moral figure who would raise his voice would be drowned out in a sea of cynicism. Maybe the pervasiveness of the internet and social media would quickly splinter and mutilate any message that would be proclaimed. Maybe Americans are too diverted to hear it, too preoccupied or too anxious to care. Given the political dangers of the moment and the ominous political climate we currently inhabit, perhaps we can do no better than look to the past for that moral leadership. And so I conclude that we need to make further use of the farther reaches of King's thought. Even though he is 55 years dead, we vitally need him at this very bleak moment in American history. So what was Martin Luther King's message in its more radical manifestations? Clearly, the centerpiece of Martin Luther King's work was the ending of the 400-year scourge of racism in America. He was focally concerned about racism and racist attitudes, to be sure. The most salient aspect of assault on racism was putting an end to legal segregation in America, at which he was assuredly successful. In that sense, King was a transformational leader, as few have been, and his political triumphs is the basis for his greatness. But it is my contention that King's struggles against racism and white supremacy was part of and woven into a broader design which required, in his view, nothing less than a transformation of American society across the board. In other words, without the more revolutionary transformation, racism could not be overcome. In short, it was his belief that abolishing Jim Crow laws, which the civil rights movement did, was not equatable with ending racism. One needed to burrow down much deeper to transform and eradicate the underlying structures and institutions which give rise to racism. Okay? King's activist career spanned 13 years, from his leadership in the Montgomery bus boycott of 1955 to his assassination in Memphis on April 4th, 1968. Among the major events of that brief 13 years was the Montgomery bus boycott, which was a success, a campaign to end segregation in Albany, Georgia in 1961, which was not, the Birmingham demonstrations of 1963, the Selma marches for voting rights in 1965, his encounter with racism in Chicago in 1966, his dialogue with Black Power advocates after marches in Mississippi in 1966, preparation for the Poor People's March in 66, his stand against the Vietnam War in 1967 and 68, and his final march in support of Memphis garbage workers in 1968. Those are the highlights of his 13-year career. As I will show, King always maintained a radical critique of American society throughout his career. But it was in his final 3 years of his life, from 1965 to 68, that he became increasingly radicalized still, and his political language and the emphases of his political struggles underwent a transformation. King was uncompromising in his principles, which led him to be named by J. Edgar Hoover as, quote, the most dangerous man in America, and then blackmailed by the FBI, which urged him to commit suicide. But King was unfazed by being ensnared by phony anti-communist witch hunts. Two of his top advisors, Bayard Rustin, who was an amazing man, he was brilliant, he was one of his major theoreticians, who both had communist leanings earlier on and was out of the closet as a gay African-American man. I mean, it was very unusual. And Bayard Rustin was a very interesting dude, let me tell you. Two of his top advisors, Bayard Rustin in his earlier life and Stanley Levinson, a white guy, throughout had communist ties. And King had great praise for W.E.B. Du Bois, the great African-American intellectual, even in Du Bois's later phase when he gave up on America and moved to Ghana and retained his membership in the Communist Party. Interesting, there have been three great integrationist Black leaders since the Civil War. One was Frederick, and they overlapped. One was Frederick Douglass. The next was W.E.B. Du Bois, the great Harvard intellectual, and so on, and then Martin Luther King. And just a little bit of trivia here, Du Bois and King never physically met, which is interesting. And Du Bois died on the eve of the March on Washington in August 1963. And King heard about his death right before he gave that speech. An interesting sort of little tidbit of history. King was also an ally of anti-colonialist leaders. He was an international figure. I think we have to look at King not merely as an American icon and hero, but as an internationalist. King was an ally of anti-colonialist leaders who were engaged in liberation struggles against their European masters. He paid tribute to Nehru and communed with Ben Bella, the premier of the newly independent Algeria. Indeed, King saw segregation in international terms as our form of colonialism and the fight against segregation as America's anti-imperialist struggle. It's an interesting sort of parallel. I mean, I'm a student of human rights, that the American civil rights struggle in the 50s and 60s took place in parallel with the anti-colonialist struggles that African and Asian nations, in effect, were engaging at that time. And some people have interpreted, it's a loose interpretation, but some people have interpreted the civil rights movement as our analog of anti-colonialism. It's really an interesting thought, and that's where I got that quote that comes from the letter from the Birmingham jail about creeping. It's a beautiful quote. We still creep at horse and and buggy stage, right, for a cup of coffee at the lunch hour while the countries of Asia and Africa are gaining their independence, a type of acknowledgement of the simultaneity, at least, of those different struggles in different parts of the world, okay? I'll get to it a little later on, but to illustrate further my point, while never a communist, nevertheless, King maintained a militant critique of the evils of capitalism, and in fact identified himself, and people don't want to hear this, most of them are, you won't hear this at your Martin Luther King conventions tomorrow night, okay? He, in effect, identified himself as a democratic socialist, okay? He didn't say it out loud very often, but clearly he did say it, and he did basically claim to be a democratic socialist in conversations that we had. In the words of Cornel West, who I'm happy to say was my mentor when I was a student at Columbia. Cornell and I had a rather close relationship. I haven't seen him in a long time, but he's doing other things. Not totally approving of his current route, but anyway, brilliant guy. According to Cornel West, quote, "The radical King was a warrior for peace on the domestic and global battlefields. He was a staunch anti-colonial and anti-imperial thinker and fighter. His revolutionary commitment to nonviolent resistance in America and abroad tried to put a brake on the escalating militarism running amok across the globe. As a decade-long victim of the vicious and vindictive FBI, King was a radical libertarian as well as having closeted democratic socialist leanings. The radical King was a democratic socialist who sided with the poor and working people in the class struggle taking place in capitalist societies. This class struggle may be visible or invisible, manifest or latent, but it rages on in the fight over resources, power, and space. In the past 30 years, we have witnessed a top-down, one-sided class war against poor and working people in the name of a morally bankrupt policy of deregulating markets, lowering taxes, and cutting spending for those who are already socially neglected and economically abandoned," end quote. To start at the beginning, King's political vision borrowed from several sources, including the Black integrationist tradition, of which Frederick Douglass and W.E. Du Bois were his most prominent precursors. He was also profoundly influenced by the nonviolent direct action of Mohandas Gandhi and the American Henry David Thoreau. King's thought was also shaped when he was studying for his doctorate at Boston University Divinity School by Protestant liberalism, which placed him somewhere between Christian orthodoxy and humanism. But the most powerful influence on King emerged from his rootedness and attachment to his identity as a minister in the Black Baptist Church, with its commanding message of justice, love, and hope. His primary identity, as he often said, was as a Baptist preacher, the son, grandson, and great-grandson of Baptist preachers, who continuously employed biblical ideas and allusions, both when speaking in the church and the public arena, to leverage a transformation of American society. It was also to his religious faith that he personally turned in moments of despair, of which there were very, very many, from assassination attempts to continual death threats, sometimes 40 a day, to vicious harassment by the FBI, to the failure of some of the civil rights campaigns that he led. In King's theology, he held to the faith that justice would ultimately prevail, and this belief became a source of hope with which he inspired those who would hear his message. As you probably recall, he often repeated the refrain, quote, "The arc of morality is long, but it bends towards justice." And this commitment to justice, rooted in his Christian faith, was absolute and unwavering. Let me just say, I wish I had more time, as a parenthesis, that famous phrase, "the arc of morality is long, but it bends towards justice," inspired Barack Obama. In the Oval Office, he had several quotes on the rug, in the carpet in the Oval Office, and he had that quote, right, in the rug. But it was not original to Martin Luther King. It actually came from the firebrand of abolition, okay, and the transcendentalist Theodore Parker, who was the most left-wing Unitarian preacher in the pre-Civil War period in America. He gave a speech in 1858 in which he made that remark. He also said in one of the speeches before the Civil War that this is a country of all the people, by all the people, and for all the people. And it's an interesting note of history. In the audience hearing Parker was a lawyer by the name of William Herndon, who was a follower of Theodore Parker, admired him, got a copy of that speech, and brought it back to Illinois and gave it to his Lord partner, Abraham Lincoln. And that phrase, of the people, by the people, for the people, again, was not original to Lincoln. It came from the prolific mind of this left-wing preacher, Theodore Parker, who influenced both Lincoln and King and so forth. Anyway, that's history. Very interesting trivia, but I find that stuff absolutely fascinating. Okay. Throughout his career, King was to appeal to a transcendent commitment to justice by the light of which he fervently believed society needed to be transformed. For example, he gave that unwavering commitment powerful articulation in what was his first major speech given during the Montgomery bus boycott. As with so many of his powerful orations, I personally can hear those cadences behind the word. He was a brilliant orator, just absolutely brilliant. And he said at that point, you might have remembered hearing this speech, he said, there will be no crosses burned at any bus stops in Montgomery. There will be no white persons pulled out of their homes and taken out on some distant road and lynched for not cooperating. There will be nobody among us who will stand up and defy the Constitution of this nation. We only assemble here because of our desire to see right exist. My friends, I want it to be known that we're going to work with grim and bold determination to gain justice on the buses in this city. And then he says, and we are not wrong. We are not wrong in what we are doing. If we are wrong, the Supreme Court of this nation is wrong. If we are wrong, the Constitution of the United States is wrong. If we are wrong, God Almighty is wrong. Okay, if we are wrong, Jesus of Nazareth was merely a utopian dreamer and never came down to earth. If we are wrong, justice is a lie. Love has no meaning. And we are determined here in Montgomery to fight and work until justice runs down like water and righteousness like a mighty stream. Wow, I love those words. I mean, incredibly powerful. Okay. One can only interpret that in proclamation not as a series of pretty words, but as a powerful call to righteous commitment to undo the evils of segregation and bring forth a condition of equality. By love, King did not mean sentimental or affectionate feelings for others. For him, love was the most powerful force that fueled his commitment to nonviolent resistance. What he meant by love is a creative understanding of where the oppressor is coming from and engaging one's enemy with a sense of redemptive goodwill. For King, hate and violence are inherently destructive, and it is this commitment which caused him to oppose figures, in fact, such as Malcolm X and Stokely Carmichael, who derided nonviolent action as an expression of weakness. For King, the love which animated nonviolent resistance was not merely an ethic, but a tactic to disarm the oppressor and ultimately transform him or her by appeal to their conscience. In the words again of Cornel West, King's, quote, radical love was a moral and practical method, a way of life and a way of struggle in which oppressed people could fight for freedom without inflicting violence on the oppressor, humiliating the opponent, and hence possibly transforming the moral disposition of one's adversary, end quote. In King's value system, hate and vengeance would breed hate, but love is transformative. Love was a manifestation, again, not of weakness, but of strength. And in the manifestation of that love through nonviolent confrontation, King believed lay not only the transformation of the oppressed condition of African Americans, but the transformation of white Americans as well. In this, the Black people of America, he believed, had a distinctive mission and a redeeming role to play for America at large, for America as a whole. We need to remember that the civil rights movement was a period of tumultuous conflict, of much violence and danger, and King bore much of that on his shoulders. It was the period of the Freedom Rides, the shock troops of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the Mississippi Summer, and assassination of those 3 civil rights workers, the Selma to Montgomery marches of 1965 with the bloody Sundays and the police beatings, the dogs and the deaths of both Black and white protesters. Selma was the last great march which ended the earlier phase of the civil rights movement and arguably opened up another one. And with it some historians noted that Martin Luther King underwent his own transformation as America and King faced new challenges. It was a complex time for both the civil rights movement and for King, as polls indicated that faith in the movement began to wane, especially in the minds of sympathetic white liberals. And King felt the challenge of the emerging Black Power movement, which questioned his commitments to nonviolent resistance. There were those, especially King's lieutenant, Bayard Rustin, who concluded that it was King's experience with the Watts riot in Los Angeles in August 1965 that deepened his radicalism and convinced him that the time had come to bring the civil rights movement from the South to the North, especially Chicago and its suburbs. And so he led marches through the poorer precincts of Chicago, where he was physically assaulted, and through white suburbs such as Cicero, Illinois, where the hatred was simply vitriolic. I mean, I remember at the time his making a statement that he had seen incredible hatred in the South, but he had never seen the hatred that he had seen in Cicero, Illinois, that he had experienced in the southern precincts of the American South. Okay, when King launched a civil rights campaign in Chicago, he was shocked by the hatred and violence expressed by working class whites as he and his followers marched through the streets of segregated neighborhoods in Chicago and its suburbs. He saw that the problem in Chicago's ghettos was not legal segregation in his view, but economic exploitation, slum housing, overpriced food, and low-wage jobs, quote, because someone profits from its existence, as he said, end quote. These experiences led King to develop a more radical outlook, historians believe. King supported President Lyndon B. Johnson's declaration of the war on poverty in 1964, but like his friend and ally, Walter Reuther, the president of the United Auto Workers, King thought that it did not go nearly far enough. As early as October 1964, he called for what he called a gigantic Marshall Plan for the poor, Black and white. That's when he began to talk openly about radical but practical solutions to America's problems, including some version again of democratic socialism. In 1966, King confided to his staff, "You can't talk about solving the economic problems of the Negro without talking about billions of dollars. You can't talk about ending the slums without first saying profit must be taken out of the slums. You're really tampering and getting on dangerous ground because now you're messing with folk then. You're messing with the captains of industry. Now this means that we are treading in difficult water because it really means that we are saying that something is wrong with capitalism. There must be a better distribution of wealth, and maybe America must move towards democratic socialism." Again, you're not going to hear this, I think, at your Martin Luther King celebrations, okay? To be clear, King was not a communist. In his 1967 book, Where Did We Go From Here?, he wrote the following: "This revolution of values must go beyond traditional capitalism and communism. We must honestly admit that capitalism has often left a gulf between superfluous wealth and abject poverty, has created conditions permitting necessities being taken from the many to give luxuries to the few, and has encouraged sweethearted men to be cold and conscienceless so that they are unmoved by suffering poverty-stricken humanity. The profit motive, when it is the sole basis of an economic system, encourages a cutthroat competition and selfish ambition that inspire men to be more I-centered than thou-centered. Truth is found in neither traditional capitalism nor in classical communism. Each represents a partial truth. Capitalism fails to see the truth in collectivism. Communism fails to realize that life is personal," end quote. That was his position, okay? It was in this period that King's philosophy of American society and the roots of racism coalesced around a grand synthesis that joined together the evils of racism with capitalism, poverty, materialism, and imperialism. All these social ills were interrelated and mutually reinforcing, suggesting again that the end of racism would have to be tied to a revolutionary reconstruction of American society, its economy, its institutions, and its values. It was at this point that his analysis of racism became global. While King held to these views throughout his career, it was in the last years of his life that they took on special urgency and became more pronounced in his sermons and speeches, both to his most immediate followers and in the public at large. Though he put forward these ideas in various venues, perhaps the best way to illustrate them is to invoke the phenomenal speech King gave in opposition to the Vietnam War. And I remember that very, very well, okay? The speech represented a major and very painful milestone in his career. That famous oration was given to an overflow crowd of more than 3,000 at Riverside Church, with a lot of people standing outside wanting to get in, at Riverside Church on April 4th, 1967, exactly to the day, the one day before he was murdered. He was murdered on April 4th, 1968, and he gave that speech here in New York City at Riverside Church against the war in Vietnam. And we have to remember, in 68, the public tide had not yet, in general, turned against the war. I mean, there was an anti-war movement, I was part of it, and so on, but the general public had not yet become, as it did later, it did not yet turn against the war in Vietnam. The rendering of that speech had a very difficult birth, and the fact that he delivered it is a testament, I believe, without a shred of cynicism, to Martin Luther King's extraordinary integrity and his monumental courage. King had been warned not to speak out against the war, and the opposition he received was not just from the public, but from his closest lieutenants and most trusted advisors, associates, and comrades. He was almost alone in his willingness to speak out against the war. It was a very difficult move for him. He was told that as a civil rights leader, he was not qualified to speak about international affairs. He was warned by colleagues that speaking out against the war would cut down on contributions from his liberal backers, who saw no connection between Mississippi and the Mekong Delta. Speaking out against the war would antagonize Lyndon Johnson, whose political support he needed to pass legislation. In the eyes of many who saw King as a hero, he became not a hero, but, quote, a communist dupe, a troublemaker, a traitor, and at best very naive. He was called all those names by people close and far, his friends and his enemies. After he delivered the speech, the Washington Post criticized his, quote, sheer inventions of unsupported fantasy, end quote, and lamented how, quote, many who have listened to him with respect will never again accord him the same confidence, end quote. The New York Times called Dr. King's remarks both facile and slander. It said the moral issues in Vietnam, quote, are less clear-cut than he suggests, end quote, and warned that, quote, to divert the energies of the civil rights movement to the Vietnam issue is both wasteful and self-defeating, end quote. That's my New York Times, which I read every morning, and still, I don't believe everything I read, but I still love the New York Times, right? Not there and then, okay. But King gave that speech anyway, okay, despite all the blowback he got before and what came after. And I truly believe it was because he thought that the war was a great evil, and he simply, his conscience would not permit him to remain silent. I think it comes down to nothing more complex than that, okay? As he said in his introduction, I come to this magnificent house of worship tonight because my conscience leaves me no other choice. And then joining together racism and poverty, he noted the following. Perhaps a more tragic recognition of reality took place when it became clear to me that the war was doing far more than devastating the hopes of the poor at home. It was sending their sons and brothers and their husbands to fight and die in extraordinarily high proportions relative to the rest of the population. We are taking the black young men who had been crippled by our society and sending them 8,000 miles away to guarantee liberties in Southeast Asia, which they had not found in Southwest Georgia and East Harlem. So we have seen repeatedly faced with the cruel irony of watching Negro and white boys on TV screens as they kill and die together for a nation that has been unable to seat them together in the same schools. So we watch them in brutal solidarity burning the huts of a poor village, but realize that they would hardly live on the same block in Chicago. I could not be silent in the face of such cruel manipulation of the poor. I am convinced
convinced that if we are to get on the right side of the world revolution, we as a nation must undergo a radical revolution of values. We must rapidly begin the shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society. When machines and computers, my goodness, 1968, when machines and computers, profit motors and property tax rights are considered more important than people, the giant triplets of racism, extreme materialism, and militarism are incapable of being conquered, end quote. Those are incredible words. Can you imagine? In that speech, having called America, quote, the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, King declared that, quote, we are called to speak for the weak, voiceless, for the victims of our nation, and for those it calls enemy. For no document from human hands can make these humans any less than our brothers. Bringing this to an end. Here was Martin Luther King using the power of his moral conviction to draw a line between American militarism at its worst, the excesses of capitalism, which institutionalized poverty at the expense of the greed and of the powerful, all feeding into the crime of racism, which oppressed his Black brothers and corrupted his fellow white citizens, whom he refused to give up on. Martin Luther King was a crusader against the scourge of racism. He was an enemy of violence. He was an apostle of love. He was a champion for the dispossessed, and he was a citizen of the world. He stood against the bleak forces which had come over us with such menacing power. If he were with us today, he would be fighting against the enduring ugliness of racism, but even more militantly. He would decry the evils of an economic system which has divided our society perhaps more than he or even we could imagine. He would condemn the scapegoating of the immigrant and the refugee. And as an internationalist, he would speak out against the excesses of globalization, and he would fervently condemn a small-minded and hateful nationalism which has cast a pall over our nation and other nations as well. But my point has been that he would be doing this not as a bleeding heart do-gooder, not as a naive idealist or rosy optimist, not as a dreamer, but as a radical and revolutionary militant and passionate activist who hated what America was doing, but did not hate this country, and as someone who knew that love was not a sign of weakness, but of enduring and courageous strength and power. Well, I would like to end my address this morning with my favorite passage from King's earlier period, which he inscribed in the justly famous letter from the Birmingham jail, which in my opinion is one of the finest pieces of prose writing in the English language in the 20th century. It makes the case for the fierce urgency of now, a message we certainly need to hear in our times. Let me just say, as another little historical note, it's not apocryphal. I looked it up. He actually wrote the letter from the Birmingham jail in the margins of newspapers. He was given papers to read and was able to smuggle them out, right, with this incredible speech. It's about 16 pages long. I read an incredible speech right on the margins of newspapers. It's an incredible piece of prose. And I want to read to you my favorite passage from it, which I think is just amazing, and so on. He says, we know through painful experience that freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. Frankly, I have yet to engage in a direct action campaign that was well-timed in the views of those who have not suffered unduly from the disease of segregation. Let me just mention, I should mention this, I should have said this at the beginning, that the letter from the Birmingham jail was written to 11 of his ministerial colleagues, white. I think there were 9 Protestant ministers and 2 rabbis who supported the civil rights movement. They were his allies, but they basically said to him, go slow. Okay, don't take the campaign to the streets where it just aggravates tensions and so on and so forth. Use the courts, go slow. And this letter is written to them, to his allies in this regard. Okay. He goes on to say, for years now, I have heard the word wait. It rings in the ear of every Negro with piercing familiarity. This wait has almost always meant never. We come to see with one of our distinguished jurists that justice too long delayed is justice denied. We have waited more than 340 years for our constitutional and God-given rights. The nations of Asia and Africa are moving with jet-like speed toward gaining political independence, but we still creep at horse and buggy pace toward gaining a cup of coffee at the lunch counter. Perhaps it is easy for those who have never felt the stinging darts of segregation to say, wait. But when you have seen vicious mobs lynch your mothers and fathers at will and drown your sisters and brothers at whim, when you have seen hate-filled policemen curse, kick, and even kill your Black brothers and sisters, when you see the vast majority of your 20 million Negro brothers smothering in an airtight cage of poverty in the midst of an affluent society, when you suddenly find your tongue twisted and your speech stammering as you seek to explain to your 6-year-old daughter why she can't go to the public amusement park that has just been advertised on television, and see tears welling up in her eyes when she is told that Funtown is closed to colored children, and see ominous clouds of inferiority begin to form in her little mental sky, and see her beginning to distort her personality by developing an unconscious bitterness towards white people. When you have come to concoct an answer for a 5-year-old son who is asking, Daddy, why do white people treat colored people so mean? When you take a cross-country drive and find it necessary to sleep night after night in the uncomfortable corners of your automobile because no more motel will accept you. When you are humiliated day in and day out by nagging signs reading white and colored, when your first name becomes nigger, your middle name becomes boy, however old you are, and your last name becomes John, and your wife and mother are never given the respected title Mrs. When you're harried by day and haunted by night by the fact that you are a Negro living constantly at tiptoe stance, never quite knowing what to expect next, and are plagued with inner fears and outer resentments, when you are forever fighting a degenerating sense of nobodiness, then you will understand why we find it difficult to wait. There comes a time when the cup of endurance runs over and men are no longer willing to be plunged into the abyss of despair. I hope, sirs, you can understand our legitimate and unavoidable impatience. Thank you.